My name's Adrian. I'm 29 now, but this all started when I was 23. Back then, I was the kind of guy people politely described as still figuring things out. I wasn't broke exactly. I worked as a junior architect at a small firm, but I wasn't driving fancy cars or posting vacation photos from exotic islands like my older brother, Lucas. He was Mom's pride and joy. Everything he did was golden in her eyes, while everything I did was a nice start, but maybe you should aim higher. She had a way of saying it that sounded like advice, but felt like a cut. I grew up knowing she believed Lucas was destined for great things, while I was destined to watch from the sidelines. When I met Claire, my fiancée, it felt like my luck was finally turning. She was warm, funny, and grounded. She didn't care that I didn't have the flashiest life. She liked that I was passionate about my work and that I wasn't obsessed with showing off. We were engaged after a year, planning a small, elegant wedding that reflected us perfectly. Mom was polite about it, but I could tell she wasn't thrilled. She made comments like, "You're sure you can provide for her?" Or, "It's a big responsibility, Adrian. Women have needs." At first, I brushed it off. She'd always been like that. The first real crack appeared at a family dinner. We were all seated around my parents' long mahogany table, Lucas across from me, Mom at the head like some kind of queen. Between bites of roasted chicken, she casually said, "Claire, you'd look stunning in a place like Lucas's penthouse. You've been there, haven't you?" Claire smiled politely and said no. Mom didn't miss a beat. "You should. The view of the city is incredible. I keep telling Lucas he should settle down. Someone like you could inspire him to." I laughed it off at the time, thinking it was just Mom being her usual tone-deaf self. But Claire's hand under the table was tense, her fingers stiff in mine. That night, she asked me if my mom didn't like her. I told her it wasn't her. Mom just had a lifelong habit of comparing me to Lucas. What I didn't realize was that this wasn't just harmless dinner conversation. Mom was planting seeds. Over the next few months, little things started changing. Claire would come back from errands and mention she'd run into Lucas, who just happened to be in the same part of town. Or she'd get texts from Mom inviting her to help plan a surprise for me, which I thought was sweet, until I noticed those plans never materialized. When I'd ask about them, Claire would get vague, saying it was just small talk. I wanted to believe her. Then came the night I'll never forget. I'd worked late on a project and swung by my parents' house to drop off some old family photos Mom had been asking for. As I walked up the driveway, I noticed Lucas's car parked out front. Inside, laughter spilled from the living room. I peeked in through the side window, just instinct, not suspicion, and froze. Mom, Lucas, and Claire were sitting together, glasses of wine in hand, deep in conversation. Mom was leaning forward, speaking low but clear enough for me to catch. "Claire, you're a smart woman. Lucas can give you the life Adrian never could. He's already established. He can give you security, status, everything a woman deserves." Lucas smirked like this was all perfectly natural. Claire didn't look offended. She looked thoughtful. My heart was pounding so hard I thought they might hear it. I didn't stick around to hear more. I left without knocking, drove home, and sat in the dark for hours, replaying her words in my head. Every instinct told me to confront them right away, but another part of me, the quieter, colder part, told me to wait, to watch, to see just how deep this went. Over the next 2 weeks, I noticed Claire pulling away. She was too tired for date nights, too busy for wedding planning. Then one evening, she sat me down at my own kitchen table, hands folded neatly in front of her like she was in a meeting. "Adrian, I think we rushed into this," she began, not meeting my eyes. My chest tightened. She talked about how she needed stability, how she wasn't sure we were aligned for the future. I knew exactly whose words those were. They had Mom's fingerprints all over them. But the final blow came when she said, "Lucas understands what I need." I didn't ask if she meant emotionally or financially. I didn't need to. She packed her things within the week. There was no dramatic fight, no begging her to stay. I just let her go. But as she walked out my door, suitcase in hand, she gave me this look, half guilty, half triumphant, and I knew Mom had gotten exactly what she wanted. I cut off all contact after that. No calls, no texts, no holiday visits. I left my job, moved to a different city, and built my life from the ground up with a kind of single-minded focus I'd never had before. I didn't tell them where I went. As far as they knew, I'd vanished. And in a way, I had. But the thing about disappearing is you get to choose when to come back. And years later, I did. It happened on a glittering Friday night, under the warm glow of chandeliers at a lavish charity gala. I was no longer the still figuring it out younger son. I was the man running the show, the host of the event itself. And when I saw Mom, Lucas, and Claire walk through those grand doors, their arms linked like a family portrait, I smiled. Because the moment they saw who I was, and more importantly, who was standing beside me, their smiles vanished in an instant. And that's when they saw my wife. The moment our eyes met across the ballroom, it was like time froze, except for the sharp, invisible crackle in the air between us. Mom's smile faltered, Lucas's grip on Claire's hand tightened ever so slightly, and Claire looked like she'd just stepped into a nightmare she didn't know was still breathing. My wife, standing beside me in an emerald green gown that caught the light with every move, tilted her head and whispered something that made me laugh softly. I didn't need to look at my family to know they were burning with questions. But before that night, before I ever stood in this room in control, there was a long stretch of years where their shadows still reached me, even from afar. At first, I told myself I'd moved on. I worked brutal hours, investing every bit of myself into my career. I started my own design firm with a small team and a few risky contracts that could have ended me if they failed. They didn't fail. Within 3 years, we were winning bids against firms that had once turned me away without a second glance. I didn't post about it. I didn't send updates. I knew my family. If they didn't hear my name, they'd assume I'd stayed the second-place son. And that suited me just fine. But then, little reminders of them started creeping into my life again. At first it was small, an email from an old family friend just checking in, slipping in comments about how Lucas and Claire are doing so well. They'd bought a huge house in the suburbs. Lucas's business was booming, though knowing him, that meant his investors were doing the real work. And, of course, Mom was proud as ever. Apparently, she kept telling people Lucas had saved Claire from a life of uncertainty. It wasn't just pride. It was rewriting history. They were erasing me from my own story. The real gut punch came when I attended an industry networking event about 2 years after I left. I was there to meet potential partners, but halfway through the night, I heard a familiar laugh. Turning toward the sound, I spotted Lucas in a tailored navy suit, glass in hand, holding court with a small circle. Claire was on his arm, wearing the kind of diamond bracelet that screamed, "Look what I can afford." I considered walking the other way, until I realized they hadn't seen me yet. That's when I overheard Lucas say, "Yeah, my mom always knew I was the one who'd make something of himself. My brother, well, he meant well, but he didn't have the drive." Claire saw that too. The people around him chuckled politely, and Claire just sipped her wine with the faintest smirk. It was such a clean, public dismissal of my entire existence that I had to walk outside before I said something I'd regret. After that night, the anger stopped being a dull background noise. It became something sharper, something I could use. Still, they kept popping up. Lucas sent a LinkedIn connection request out of the blue, not to reconcile, but to invite me to a business opportunity presentation for one of his ventures. I didn't respond. Mom sent an email around the holidays one year, guilt-tripping me about not making an effort and hinting that family always forgives. Forgives, as if I'd been the one who betrayed anyone. And yet, I could tell from the way they kept trying to loop me in, on their terms, that they wanted to keep me in my place. They wanted me to see their success, to silently acknowledge their version of events, that I was the one who'd been left behind. What they didn't know was that my life had quietly grown far beyond theirs. I'd moved into a penthouse, not to show off, but because I could. I'd invested in real estate, built side businesses, and by my late 20s, I was no longer just doing well. I was in a position where I could walk into a room and control the conversation. And the more I built, the more one thought kept circling in my mind. If the day ever came when our paths crossed again, I wouldn't just be prepared. I'd be holding all the cards. That day came sooner than I expected. An acquaintance of mine, someone high up in the philanthropic scene, suggested I host a charity gala for a cause I genuinely cared about. It wasn't just a business move, it was personal. It was a chance to stand on a stage, not as someone's lesser son, but as the man who had built his own name. Invitations went out to every corner of my network, some intentionally reaching into the old social circles my family still lingered in. And so, that night in the grand hall, under crystal chandeliers, with cameras flashing and a string quartet playing in the background, I saw them walk in. Mom, Lucas, and Claire, dressed to impress, clearly thinking they were the stars of the evening, until they realized whose name was printed on the gold-trimmed program. Lucas's face flickered with something between surprise and discomfort. Mom tried to recover with a gracious smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. And Claire, her eyes darted from me to my wife, and something in her expression tightened, like she'd just been caught in a memory she didn't want to remember. I could feel the tension building, like a bow being drawn back. But I didn't walk over. Not yet. I wanted them to stew in it, to feel the ground shift under their feet as the night went on. And then, in a moment I'll never forget, Mom leaned toward Lucas and whispered something, probably thinking I couldn't see, and he nodded. Whatever she said, it was clear they were already scheming. They still thought they could play me. That was their first mistake. It happened just 40 minutes into the gala, right after the first round of speeches ended. I had been making my way through the crowd, shaking hands, smiling for photos, and letting my wife handle conversations with some of the higher-profile donors. From across the room, I noticed Lucas and Claire slip away from the main floor. At first, I thought nothing of it. People wander off all the time at these events, but then I caught a glimpse of my mother following them. Something in my gut tightened. It wasn't curiosity that pulled me after them. It was instinct. The same instinct that had made me pause outside that living room years ago when I first heard my mother offering my fiancée to my brother like a business deal. I moved quietly, weaving through waiters carrying trays of champagne until I reached a side corridor leading toward the private lounge area. The gala venue had a handful of smaller rooms set aside for quiet meetings, and I found the three of them in one of these, the door half open. My mother's voice carried just enough for me to catch her words. "You need to use this. He's in over his head here. All this flash, all these people, it's just for show. Find out who's backing him. If we can get in on it, we can make sure he doesn't shut us out again." Lucas leaned against the wall, looking smug. I doubt he's got the capital for something like this on his own. Probably some investor propping him up. We figure out who. Maybe we offer them a better deal. Then Claire's voice, calm, measured, as if she were discussing nothing more serious than a dinner menu, cut in. Or, she said, I could just talk to him. He used to trust me. He'd tell me things if I approached it the right way. He's still a man, Lucas. You know how to use that. I didn't move. I just stood there, absorbing each word like a slow drip of poison. They weren't just here to crash my event. They were actively plotting to undermine me, to pry into my business, to take something they assumed I hadn't earned. And Claire, she wasn't just my ex. She was the woman who had once promised to marry me, now casually offering to manipulate me like a mark. It was surreal, standing there in my own event space, in a tailored suit I'd bought with my own money, listening to the same people who had gutted me years ago try to do it again. I thought about walking in right then, about tearing into them in front of each other, but something stopped me. Not fear, strategy. Because in that moment, I realized something important. They hadn't changed. All these years, they still thought I was the same younger brother, the same son they could push around. They were so convinced of their own superiority that they didn't even consider the possibility that I might be listening, that I might already know more than they did. But as I stood there, my chest tight with anger, my wife appeared at the far end of the corridor. She caught my eye and raised an eyebrow, silently asking what was going on. I gave the faintest shake of my head, a signal to hold back. She didn't press. Instead, she turned and disappeared into the crowd again, giving me the space to make my decision. And that's when I heard the final, unfiltered truth spill from my mother's mouth. He was always the weak one. He's lucky we even came tonight. This could be our way to finally fold him into something worthwhile. And if he doesn't play along, she let the sentence hang. Lucas smirked. Claire looked at him, and then back toward the ballroom, like she could already see the path opening. That was it. The last shred of lingering family loyalty I'd been holding on to snapped clean in two. Whatever hope there had been for reconciliation, for some kind of civil coexistence, was gone. They had made it perfectly clear they weren't here for me. They were here for what they thought they could take from me. I stepped back from the doorway, my decision already forming in my mind. If they wanted a game, I'd give them one. But it wouldn't be the one they thought they were playing. And for the first time in years, I felt that same cold, quiet resolve I'd felt the night Claire walked out of my apartment. Only this time, I wasn't going to disappear. This time they were. I didn't confront them that night. Not yet. That was the hardest part. Walking back into the main ballroom with my face composed, my posture steady, while inside, my stomach churned like I'd swallowed glass. My wife glanced at me when I returned to her side. She didn't ask what happened, but the slight narrowing of her eyes told me she already had a guess. The rest of the evening was a blur of polite conversation, clinking glasses, and forced smiles. Every time I looked across the room, I caught them watching me. My mother with that same assessing gaze she'd worn my whole life, Lucas with a calculating smirk, and Claire with an expression I couldn't quite read. Was it curiosity? Anticipation? Or just the same quiet arrogance she'd shown when she left me? When the gala ended and the last guests filtered out, I stayed behind with my team to handle a few final details. The music was off, the lights dimmed, and the silence of the now empty hall felt heavy. I could still hear my mother's voice in my head, every word replaying on a loop. Week 1, get in on it. He's lucky we came. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling while my wife slept beside me. I felt something I hadn't felt in years, a familiar ache, the same one I'd carried in those first months after they betrayed me. Back then, it had been loneliness. This time, it was something sharper. It wasn't that they'd hurt me again. It was that they'd reminded me just how much I had let their absence shape me. Over the following weeks, I went through the motions of my life, but I wasn't myself. I made small mistakes at work, not enough for anyone to notice, but enough for me to feel it. I found myself replaying every past slight, every moment when I had stood in their shadow, every time I'd swallowed my pride instead of speaking. It was like reopening an old wound that had never fully healed. I started avoiding social events where they might appear. Declined invitations from mutual acquaintances. My wife noticed and asked if I was feeling burned out. I told her I was just tired from work, but that wasn't the truth. The truth was, I felt that same urge I'd felt years ago, the one to vanish, to put a wall between myself and anything connected to them. But here's the thing, I didn't. Because somewhere in that fog of frustration and exhaustion, I realized I had two options. I could let them push me back into the shadows like they'd done before. Or I could turn this boiling, unspent anger into something else, something useful. So I started paying attention again, watching, listening. Whenever someone mentioned Lucas's business, I asked casual questions, just enough to learn that things weren't as rock solid as he liked to pretend. Rumors of missed deadlines. Investors pulling out. Claire, I heard, was keeping up appearances, but a few people hinted she wasn't exactly happy playing the perfect wife role. I didn't make any moves yet. Not outwardly, but in my mind, pieces were shifting into place. I started to imagine what it would look like to not just defend myself this time, but to hit back, publicly, unmistakably, and in a way they couldn't twist. Still, the ache lingered. I'd come so far, and yet, seeing them again had reminded me just how much I'd built my success in reaction to them. It wasn't enough to just keep building my life anymore. No, I needed to make sure they knew exactly who I'd become without them, and what crossing me would cost. And as I began quietly laying the groundwork, I realized something chilling. They were still trying to play their game. Every so often, a mutual friend would pass along a message from my mother, asking if we could meet for coffee. Lucas sent a text, just one, saying we should talk about opportunities. Claire didn't reach out directly, but I heard through the grapevine that she had been asking about my wife. They thought they were circling me, but I was already building the trap. I decided the first step wasn't confrontation, it was elevation. If they thought they could still reach me, still get close enough to play their games, I'd rise so far above their reach that they'd have to crane their necks just to see where I was standing. The months after the gala were a blur of calculated momentum. I threw myself into my firm with a precision that bordered on obsession. Every pitch we made was sharper, every proposal backed by research so airtight it was impossible to refuse. I expanded into markets I'd been cautious about before, high-end commercial spaces, luxury residential projects for clients with deep pockets and long memories. These weren't just jobs, they were statements. And the statements were heard. Within 8 months, my company was not just profitable, it was thriving. We landed a project that put my name in industry publications, the kind of coverage that sticks in people's minds. My face was on the cover of one magazine, smiling in front of a model of a high-profile development. It wasn't vanity, it was visibility. The more my name appeared, the more I noticed a shift in the way people treated me. Doors that had been closed years ago now opened with invitations. Meanwhile, I didn't just focus on architecture. I diversified. Real estate investments, partnerships in hospitality, even a small stake in a tech startup run by a friend from my early career days. Every move was deliberate. Every step made it harder for them to believe the week one narrative they'd been feeding people. And as my professional life soared, so did my personal one. My wife and I traveled. Paris, Santorini, Kyoto. Each trip a reminder of the life I'd built without anyone's approval but my own. She was more than a partner. She was my sounding board, my confidant. She never pushed me to act against my family, but she understood. Sometimes, she understood without me even having to say the words. I started hosting events, not on the scale of the gala, but intimate, curated evenings with influential guests. Politicians, business leaders, creatives, and philanthropists. People who valued discretion, but also remembered who made them feel seen. Word got around, and suddenly, I wasn't just a businessman, I was a connector. A name worth knowing. That's when I started hearing about Lucas more frequently, and not in flattering ways. His business was slipping. 2 of his largest contracts had fallen through. An investor had backed out after a disagreement over spending. There were whispers that he'd over-leveraged himself buying that mansion in the suburbs. And Claire? I heard her name in hushed conversations, paired with words like restless and isolated. I didn't reach out. I didn't gloat. I let the distance grow because I knew that every inch of it made my eventual move sharper. The turning point in my rise came when I was invited to co-chair a massive annual fundraising event, one that eclipsed the gala I'd hosted. This wasn't just about charity. It was a power nexus, a place where deals were made over glasses of champagne, and the right introductions could alter someone's trajectory overnight. The invitation wasn't just an honor. It was a declaration that I'd arrived in a league they could never have imagined for me. And I made sure the guest list included just enough people from the old circles to guarantee the news would reach my mother, Lucas, and Claire. Not as an invitation, no, not yet, but as a headline they couldn't ignore. By then, my network was so wide that any information I wanted, I could get. I didn't even have to dig for it. Mutual contacts would volunteer it, unprompted, as if feeding me updates on their decline was a favor. And each piece of news was another brick in the wall I was building between the man they thought I was and the man I had become. Still, I kept my movements quiet. I wanted them curious. I wanted them wondering how I'd gone from struggling younger son to someone they couldn't even approach without an introduction. And most importantly, I wanted them to come to me, because when they finally did, I'd be ready. And that opportunity came faster than I expected. A mutual acquaintance, someone who still drifted between my world and theirs, let slip that Lucas was desperate to land a contract on a development I was partially funding. He didn't know I was involved yet, but he would. And I decided, right then, that it was time to stop letting them circle in the dark. It was time to draw them into the light. The tip about Lucas's desperation was the crack I'd been waiting for. The project in question was a luxury mixed-use development, prime real estate in a booming part of the city. I wasn't the face of it, which was deliberate. My stake was tucked away behind a holding company, shielded by layers of investment partners. On paper, I was just one of many contributors. In reality, I had more influence over the decision-making than anyone outside the inner circle could guess. I called my contact on the project's board, a man named Porter who had a fondness for expensive cigars and even more expensive secrets. "I hear there's interest from a Lucas Hale," I said casually over lunch, watching his reaction. Porter smirked. "Your brother?" he asked, surprised. "He's been making noise about wanting in, but, well, his proposal is shaky. And between you and me, his reputation isn't exactly helping." That was useful, more than useful. Reputation, in my circles, wasn't just about image, it was currency. And Lucas was running low. I leaned back, swirling the last sip of my drink. "If he pushes again, tell him the board's considering other candidates." But I paused just long enough to make it sound like an afterthought. If I were to back someone's involvement, it might carry weight. Porter caught on immediately. He didn't press for details. In this world, knowing too much could be a liability. But the seed was planted. Lucas's access now depended on me, whether he realized it or not. Over the next few weeks, I quietly gathered more threads. Through another contact, a financial advisor I'd met at a charity dinner, I learned that Lucas had taken on high-interest bridge loans to cover his cash flow issues. That explained the urgency. He wasn't just chasing the development for prestige. He needed the payout to keep from sinking. And then came the real gem, Claire. I didn't go looking for dirt, but sometimes dirt finds you. A woman I'd worked with on a design project mentioned she'd seen Claire at an upscale cafe with a man who was definitely not Lucas. She wasn't being coy. She described them laughing, leaning in close, holding hands across the table. I didn't react outwardly, but inside, I felt the old, familiar flicker of satisfaction. Not because I cared about Claire anymore, but because I knew what this meant. The cracks in their perfect image were widening, and I now held more than enough leverage to pull them apart entirely. But I didn't rush. This wasn't about exposing them right away. It was about timing. It was about engineering a moment so precise that when the truth landed, it would leave no escape route. That's when I made the call to the event coordinator for the annual fundraising gala I was co-chairing. I gave them an updated guest list, long, curated, and filled with people I wanted in that room. Near the bottom, I added 3 names that would seem out of place to anyone who didn't know the history: my mother, Lucas, and Claire. It wasn't a peace offering. It was bait. The invitations went out 2 weeks later, embossed on thick cream cardstock, sealed with the event's crest. I knew they'd accept. Pride wouldn't let them stay away, not from an event where I would be the one greeting guests at the door, shaking hands, and giving the keynote address. And when they walked into that ballroom, they wouldn't just see me. They'd see the people whose respect they'd always craved, the kind of people who didn't just talk about influence, but wielded it like a blade. I'd be standing in the center of that world. They'd be on the outside, trying to find a way in. And that's when I'd decide how to let them in, or if I would at all. The night of the gala arrived crisp and clear, the kind of autumn evening where the air felt expensive. The venue, a restored Art Deco theater, glowed from within, every window spilling warm light onto the marble steps. I stood at the entrance with my wife, greeting guests as they arrived. Each handshake, each smile, was deliberate. This was my arena now. When the black sedan pulled up and my mother stepped out in a deep navy gown, her expression was poised but hungry, scanning the crowd for recognition. I didn't flinch. Lucas followed, wearing a suit that was almost perfect, almost just a touch too eager, as if hoping to prove he still belonged among people like this. Claire emerged last, her dress shimmering in the lamplight, her arm hooked through his. She smiled, but it was thin. "Adrian," my mother said warmly, as though the last decade hadn't happened. "What a surprise to see you here." I returned the smile, cool and steady. "Not a surprise, Mom. I co-chair this year." The flicker in her eyes was almost imperceptible, but I caught it. Lucas glanced around, clearly noting who else was in attendance, names he'd tried to court for years. Claire's gaze kept darting to my wife, who stood beside me with the kind of effortless confidence that made people take notice without her saying a word. Inside, the theater had been transformed into a jewel box of gold and deep crimson. The tables were dressed in rich linens, each centerpiece a burst of fresh flowers and candlelight. The stage was set for the evening's program, with a large screen displaying images of the charity's work. I made sure their table was in full view of the stage, and, more importantly, in earshot of several key investors from the development Lucas was chasing. Throughout the cocktail hour, I drifted from group to group, engaging in easy conversation, dropping just enough hints about current projects and selective partnerships to pique curiosity. When I finally approached their table, I did it with deliberate calm. "Lucas," I said, "I hear you've been busy in real estate." He straightened, clearly pleased to be acknowledged. "Yeah, working on some big deals. Actually, I've been looking at that downtown development. Might be the right fit for me." He said it loudly enough for the nearby investors to hear. I gave a slow nod. "Ah, the one my company's funding." The silence that followed was sharp. One of the investors at the next table turned his head slightly, interest caught. Lucas blinked, trying to mask the sudden calculation in his eyes. My mother recovered first. "Well, isn't that a coincidence? Maybe you two could work together." "That's the thing," I said evenly, keeping my tone friendly. "We're being very selective." only working with partners who have the right stability and reputation. It's not personal, it's just business. Claire shifted in her seat, crossing her legs, her jaw tight. She looked like she wanted to speak, but thought better of it. I caught the glance she threw toward one of the investors, one that wasn't lost on me. The first course was served, conversation moving around them like water flowing past a stone. I didn't need to say more. The message was already there, hanging in the air for everyone nearby to absorb. I was the gatekeeper now. But the real move came later in the evening, during the auction segment. The host was calling for bids on an exclusive architectural consultation, an item I'd donated personally. I'd expected it to go to one of the higher-profile donors. But when the bidding reached an impressive figure, Lucas raised his paddle. The room reacted, surprised murmurs, a few raised brows. I smiled. "That's generous, Lucas," I said into the mic. Though I should mention the consultation is contingent on working with clients whose projects align with our brand standards. The words were polite, but in this crowd, they landed like a verdict. Everyone understood. He could bid all he wanted, but without my approval, there was no deal. The host moved on quickly, and Lucas lowered his paddle, face tight. My mother's lips pressed into a thin line, and Claire suddenly found her wine glass very interesting. I'd drawn the line in front of everyone who mattered to them, and done it without a single raised voice. They couldn't spin it as pettiness. It was just business, and they'd been shut out. But the night wasn't over. I had one last card to play. It came during the final toast, when I invited my wife on stage to thank the donors. As she stepped up beside me, the lights catching the diamond on her hand, I could see Claire's eyes widen just a fraction, recognition dawning. Because my wife wasn't just stunning. She was someone Claire had met years ago, briefly, when she was still with me. Someone she had underestimated completely. I watched as Claire leaned ever so slightly toward Lucas, whispering something I couldn't hear, her expression pale under the golden lights. That was the moment I knew they realized the game had shifted entirely. And I wasn't done. After the toast, I stepped down from the stage with my wife, and the applause rolled over us like a wave. We returned to mingling, but I could feel their eyes on me from across the room. My mother, Lucas, and Claire sitting in a tight, silent triangle at their table. The energy around them had shifted completely. Where earlier they'd been leaning into conversations, smiling for attention, now people passed by without stopping. It wasn't just me they were avoiding, it was the optics. In a room like this, reputation was currency, and tonight they'd lost a stack of it in front of the very people they'd been hoping to impress. The real hit came 2 days later. Porter called me. "Just a heads up, Lucas reached out again about the development. We told him we were going in a different direction. Didn't mention you, but he'll know." I thanked him, hung up, and almost immediately my phone buzzed again. This time from a mutual contact I hadn't spoken to in years. "Heard about your brother," they said, words spreading fast. "Investors are skittish. This might be the start of the end for him." It was. Within a month, 2 more of his backers pulled out, citing strategic differences. His company's social media went quiet. The flashy public appearances dried up. By winter, the mansion was quietly listed for sale. Claire, I heard, didn't stick around. She resurfaced in another city, her name occasionally appearing in charity event write-ups, but always without the same sheen she'd worn before. Those close to her knew why. Stories have a way of traveling, especially the kind whispered over wine between people who enjoy a little schadenfreude. As for my mother, she tried once to call. The voicemail was short, brittle. "I think we should talk. Family's important." I didn't return it. There was nothing left to say. Family is important, but not the kind that treats you like a pawn. The following year, I hosted the gala again. Bigger, brighter, more exclusive than before. As I stood on stage during the opening speech, I scanned the room and thought about the first gala where they'd walked in believing they still held power over me. They hadn't returned since. I raised my glass, the lights catching on the rim. "To progress," I said, smiling at the sea of faces before me. "And to remembering that those who doubt you often end up proving you right." The crowd laughed and clinked glasses, but in my mind, I was toasting 3 empty seats that no one had noticed were missing. And that was the last time I ever thought of them as anything but a closed chapter.